Hello, I'm Roger Wilkinson, the host of the TASA Thursday webinar program for 2020. Today we have Dr. Joseph Borlagdan. He is the Research and Policy Manager of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence in Victoria. And today he was going to be talking about poverty and homelessness.
Okay, great. Thank you, Roger. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. I just want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, and any that may be here today. This talk is on homelessness. I just also want to acknowledge that when we're talking about young people being in out-of-home care and when we're talking about the removal of children, that this is a colonising strategy that continues to affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, children and adults to this day. This week is Anti-Poverty Week. And the idea behind Anti-Poverty Week is that we need to go beyond simply just trying to understand poverty, but we need to do the work of eradicating it. And as sociologists, we sometimes balk at this. We're very familiar with studying the dynamics of poverty, its causes, its effects, and sometimes its solutions. And because of that familiarity, we know how hard it can be to change what appears to be more or less entrenched, but we press on regardless. Yet what we've seen recently, I think, have been some flickers of change, and they come at a time when we least expect it. So we're all in the middle of this pandemic, and as the economic recession was really starting to hit, for a very brief moment there, we saw what was the largest drop in poverty since we started measuring the poverty line, lower than what it was during pre-COVID times. And this is clearly the result of some massive income support programs that rapidly increased JobSeeker, JobKeeper supplement was introduced, and we also saw one-off payments of $750. Now, though, as promised, we're snapping back, and those temporary increases are being wound back. And I think we can expect a kind of whiplash here, and hence the image. And the poverty rate is tipped to climb above pre-COVID levels. Now, as bleak as that picture is, that forecast is, I think it's worth remembering today that when we're talking about snapping back, this is also an acknowledgement that under pressure systems can bend and inequalities can be suspended even if it is temporarily. So that's what I want us to keep in mind today for today's talk on the kind of systems that is designed to manage and control homelessness. So today I want to talk about where our systems and institutions have failed a group of some of our most vulnerable young people. And this is a group of older children, aged 10 to 16, who are left unsupported by the current homelessness services landscape. So while we don't have clear numbers on this group, across the country in Australia, we see probably thousands of unaccompanied older children who either leave home or go missing from out-of-home care placements. Now, many of those young people are couch surfing, some return to unsafe homes, and others who don't have that option will try to seek help from homeless crisis services. So what happens when they do that, when unaccompanied homeless older children present to homeless services? Well, Catherine Robinson, who you're all familiar with through TASA, her work at the Social Action Research Centre in Tasmania shows that the options are pretty limited and none of them are really suitable. most of the services that are available to this group are geared towards family reunification. But oftentimes that's unrealistic. And we see children really at the edge of care. So they, particularly the group who aren't covered by child protection orders, which means that they're then ineligible to go into out-of-home care. So what do young people do then? Well, they're often at the mercy of adult housing services because there aren't specialist homeless programs for this group. So what young people do in response is, rather than cycling through short-term crisis accommodation, they're kind of just left to fend for themselves. So again, couch surfing, and in the worst case scenarios, they're sleeping rough. So they're kind of caught, they're in this no man's land between a service that's centered around family crisis and services from the homelessness system. They're put into this limbo by systems, departments, and agencies, none of which are holding responsibility for their welfare. So in 2019, in response to this problem, the Tasmanian government brought together an independent task force, and their job was to advise the Human Services Minister on what needed to change to address this issue. And interestingly, what they did was they started by reframing the problem. So in their report, they say that this is less about a problem of homelessness and really one of carelessness. And they refer to this as the absence of care. It's where families, the state, and the broader community have failed to provide a supportive, nurturing environment to enable these children to flourish. So these are kids, they say, who are surviving without stable care, without protection or shelter. That's kind of needed for their development. And in the report, or throughout the report, they use the shorthand of carelessness and then in parentheses, absence of care. And I think we can turn to some of the sociological literature to help give this concept more weight. And to do this, I'm turning to the work of my boss, Professor Shelley Mallett, and others who talk about this sense of home, the social meaning of home. So this is a definition of home which sees a sense of home as a set of intimate relationships that foster belonging and autonomy. So it's home that's set within these caring relationships that are situated in communities and social networks rather than just physical shelter. So carelessness in this sense isn't just failing to provide, sorry, I've just lost. Sorry, I just need to get back to the screen share. Sorry. Carelessness in this sense is not just about failing to provide physical shelter and housing. It's also failing to provide a sense of home for children who have lost it. The other literature that I'm looking at to give weight to this notion of carelessness and absence of care comes from the work on ethics of the ethics of care, as well as theories of social justice. So bringing in here a democratic commitment to care that Ali Russell Hochschild discusses, the idea of care being intertwined with social justice. So Victoria Held says that there's no justice without care. And also looking at the politics of recognition, which is very closely aligned to the issue of youth homelessness. And Watson and Cuervo have got a great article where they talk about the work of Iris Young in this sense. So when we're looking at absence of care, the obverse of that, carelessness, can be defined as an inattentiveness to people's right to satisfy their expressed needs. So carelessness here is really an exercise in power. It's the transactional relationships, it's the stigmatizing discourse that is used to control people who are experiencing homelessness that in then turn shapes their subjectivities. And I think it's this latter set of meanings around the absence of care that is really useful, because it connects the personal to the structural. It opens up this idea, I think, of systemic carelessness. So this is where we've got formal and contractual models of care that perpetuate this culture of shifting responsibility elsewhere, to other agencies, to other people. Instead, we need to be promoting systemic care. So looking at our shared responsibilities and obligations, making sure that we've got accountability mechanisms that see to it that all young people are safe and cared for. So what does systemic care look like then, as opposed to systemic carelessness? What does it look like in practical terms? And how can what I'm terming as solution-oriented sociology inform that kind of change and transformation? So to go from carelessness to care really requires a comprehensive transformation at multiple levels. It's about changing practices, systems, policies, and social change. So changing people's attitudes, beliefs, how they view homeless people. Now, we call this systemic change, and very simply, it's when you observe a shift in a whole system that's made up of many interrelated parts, from a current state, which is undesirable, to a more desirable future state. At the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, we're in this fairly unique position. So I work in the Research and Policy Centre, and we work very closely with the Youth Transitions team, the service development arm of that team, as well as those delivering programs. So we're positioned at the nexus of research, policy, and practice. And this is what enables us to pursue this really ambitious goal of systemic change. Now, you've probably come across systemic change. It's quite a buzzword. It's been doing the rounds for in recent years. And there are many models of systemic change that are used. And I've just listed a couple there that you can see that we draw some inspiration from, particularly economist Mariana Mazzucato's missions framework. And this is really about an alternative way of doing capitalism. It puts innovation and social and environmental outcomes really at the center of how we think about economic growth. And what she does, she really urges government to set what she calls policy missions to address really complex policy problems using this mechanism of collaboration, which has to happen, she says, across different sectors, across community, business, and government. The other person who we also take some inspiration from is Hilary Cottam's work. And she has this 21st century model of radical help. She makes the argument that welfare systems are no longer fit for purpose. And she takes this bottom-up ethnographic approach, which is based on the work of Sen and Nussbaum on the capabilities approach. And she takes that approach to really try to understand what are the real possibilities that people have to live a good life. And she makes the case that rather than trying to fix problems and manage needs, we really should be building capacity and growing that good life. And so many of these systemic change models, they often talk about these things in fairly conceptual, abstract ways. And so what I want to focus on today is some work done by Nancy Latham and her model of systemic change in human service systems, because she takes a fairly practical approach. And what she does is she takes the complexity of systems and simplifies this into a linear structure so that we can locate where there are points of intervention in human service systems. And as you can see here, she identifies two key elements of human service systems: pathways in the middle there, and institutional structures in the grey box. Now, she says that institutional structures consist of policies, laws, regulations, funding flows, resource allocations, culture, norms, standard operating procedures, and knowledge bases. And institutional structures and pathways together form an institutional context that shapes people's experience through the human service system. So let's have a look at how this applies to a real example, to a homelessness service system. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is draw on an example of some work that we're doing in Tasmania on the homelessness service system there. Now, a lot of this work is very much in its early and design stages, so a lot of this is kind of presumptive and preemptive, but it just gives a case study of sorts of how we might apply systemic change to a homelessness service system. Okay, so when we're looking at systemic carelessness, so this is the established system, this is where things are at now. We can see that institutional structures can act as barriers. And they act as barriers because they may restrict access to a system, they may limit the benefit of services that are available. And this happens because built into this system are often these unhelpful incentives or disincentives. So for example, you see this in homeless as well as disability service systems. There's often an incentive to demonstrate your deservingness of services. And what this does is it produces contradictions where if you have any improvement in your functioning, you can lose access to the very supports that have helped to improve your functioning in the first place. Now, what happens when we have these structural barriers is that the pathways then become ineffective. And so people are often directed to services or programs that are more about fitting with the service system or complying with the program logics in that system. And they're not necessarily meeting the person's needs, or at least not meeting those needs at the right time. And so we see this in some of the systems that we look at, that there are these established pathways that they might be out of sequence, and they offer quite different support to what's actually needed. And sometimes people have to jump through several hoops and receive sort of generic forms of support before they get to the one that they actually need. What we talk about in the example in Tasmania is that one of the structural barriers are how the system connects with the community. So often there's inconsistent and weak links between homeless services, the community, and other service systems and institutions. And so the pathways are pretty ineffective. They're not tailored to need. And where there are networks which could overcome some of these weak links, they're often tied to individuals. They're not built or embedded in those systems. So when we're looking at transformation, Nancy Latham says that, well, there is scope for systems to change through these initiatives that can alter institutional structures to make them more flexible, less restrictive, and more enabling. And this is what is represented in the orange boxes in the bottom left-hand corner there. So we've got a couple of collaborative governance mechanisms that bring coherence to the system. So things like interagency groups, steering committees. And we also have these learning mechanisms, and that's what these loops indicated by the arrows are about. So this is where information is fed back into improving people's pathways through the homeless system. And what's really critical here is the work of the communities of practice, where there is that opportunity for shared practice, reflection, adapting programs and adapting delivery, which is then fed up into those higher level governance groups. And so what the work is here is really about shifting some of those incentives. So shifting incentives from ones which are often oriented around demonstrating deficits and managing crisis towards something that resembles the kind of capabilities approach that I described with Cottom's work. And this is really about an approach that identifies people's expressed needs and aspirations, and then working with community to convert some of the social and community resources into real opportunities to then build homeless people's capabilities. So when we're rethinking the homeless service system and what's its purpose, what is it for, we're proposing this kind of systemic change from carelessness to care. And thinking back to the model, I refer to this as the systemic change egg that we use at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. This is the kind of change that we're aiming to see across the different levels. So for service delivery, it's making sure that service users receive homelessness services that match the type and intensity that's appropriate to their capabilities and their stage of life in the life course. At the level of practice, we're looking at shifting how homeless services do their practice, shifting it more towards a capabilities approach with a stronger emphasis on working collaboratively with key partnerships, so that you're putting service users onto this pathway of what we refer to as connected independence. At the level of the program policy, this is about making sure that the delivery of services is targeted and timely. At the level of systems change, this is shifting that system-centered focus to one where pathways meet the person's capabilities and needs, what we refer to here as a system-centered on people approach. And lastly, we're looking at social change. So shifting how people experiencing homelessness are viewed from those stigmatizing deficit discourses towards one that where there's a focus on recognition of their needs, expressed needs, as a starting point for building capability. So again, we're at the early stages here, and in practice, based on similar work that we've done in the past, we know how challenging it is to bring about change. And so we have a raft of these tools that we've listed here at the bottom that support systemic change. Now, these tools are made up of practice and conceptual frameworks, capabilities approach theory, as well as place-based approaches. So a mix of theory and practice in there. We know, though, from experience that applying these tools isn't enough. Like that's not going to be sufficient. We also need to look at what I think, or what I'm calling, is a solution-oriented sociology. And that's what really helps us make these tools useful. So how I'm thinking about a solution-oriented sociology is along these three components. So firstly, there's an orientation to finding alternatives. So Eric Olin Wright, in his book, Envisioning Real Utopias, he calls for an emancipatory social sciences, one which kind of mines the anti-capitalist potential of existing institutions that are effective in deepening democracy. And he gives examples like worker collectives, as well as Wikipedia. And in that book, he really highlights the importance of devolving and decentralizing power to local neighborhoods, councils, and communities in what he terms a kind of moving decision-making downward as close as possible to where problems are located. We have similar ideas brought up by another sociologist, Roberto Unger. He talks about the adjacent possible, and he's interested in social innovation and saying that we need to ground social innovation so that it's within our grasp, what is possible is not this distant horizon of possibilities, but it's right here in front of us. All we need to grasp that is really a direction that we want to head in and to take some first steps. So he's making the argument that we have the resources here to what he calls create a future within the present. The second component to a solution-oriented sociology is an orientation to studying up. And there's a neat little editorial that Monica Prasad has written about this. And one of the parts of what she calls the problem-solving sociology is that particularly when you're looking at poverty, there's such an emphasis on looking at the effects of these unequal structures on victims, and quite rightly so. So those that experience the consequences. But she argues that that's a bit of a trap, because that can often be used by other people, that research can be used by other people to actually blame victims for their own circumstances. Instead, she says we should be examining the systems of rewards and punishments that guide and shape behaviour. The third component refers to the practical use of theory. So this is just basically how we use theory as a resource for problem solving. And Watts talks about this. They say that when you use theory in this way, it can actually advance theory. It's where some of the novel theorizing is done. So I think when we're looking at those three components, orienting towards alternatives, towards studying up, you can see some of that in what I've discussed so far with Latham's model of systemic change, that focus on systems, structures, and institutional policies. When it comes to the practical use of theory, I think here I want to turn to some of the theorizing work, and I'm going to use a potential example that we might use in some of the work on systemic change in homelessness systems. So one of the challenges in doing systemic change in the field of homelessness is that you're often not creating something new in a vacuum. Something already exists, and so you're actually trying to transform the status quo. Now, someone who's done some work in the area of homelessness and systemic change, David Stroh, he has found that most key actors in this field claim that they want to end homelessness. But at the same time, many of those actors receive payoffs from the established homeless system. And the established system, which tends to favour shelter and crisis accommodation. And he was talking about an example in Canada. And so if you're running a shelter, you're going to be more invested in advocating for often short-term fixes and really maintaining those shelters, making sure that they're well equipped to deal with the caseloads that you get. He also makes the point that when we're looking at these fragmented systems made up of all these piecemeal programs, that there's a degree of independence in that kind of setup, that actors in the system are often unwilling to give up. And this is particularly the case when you're trying to introduce a different way of working, which is much more focused on collaborative and interdependent kind of partnerships. And so during this kind of transformation, frontline professionals, as well as others involved in that change, might experience what Bourdieu calls hysteresis. And this is when you're occupying two opposed fields. So, you've developed your habitus in an original field, and this is really struggling to catch up with this new field. It's the structural lag, he says, between opportunities and the dispositions to grasp them. And it's referred to sometimes as a divided habitus. And this is an idea that Bourdieu really came to kind of late in his career, as he was reflecting on his own experiences growing up in a working class family, and then rising through the ranks to elite academic institutions in Paris. Since then, it's been further developed by a couple of UK sociologists, Ingram and Abrahams, and they've come up with this typology to look at some of the wider responses to a divided habitus. So they refer to it as a typology of habitus interruptions. And they say that generally two things can happen when a habitus meets a new field. Either the individual tries to keep those worlds separate, or they try to incorporate both of those fields together. So if we start on the left-hand side of this typology, this is what happens when you attempt to keep those worlds separate. So either you go with one habitus over another, and you're quite happy to abandon and leave your old habitus behind and completely adopt the new one, and that's the abandoned type, or you completely reject the new habitus, which is sort of, you kind of reconfirm, that's the reconfirm type, you kind of double down on how you've been trained and the disposition that has seen you sort of reap benefits in the field as it has been, as an established system. Now, on the right-hand side, when you try to incorporate both fields, this can result in reconciling those two fields. So this is where there's a successful bringing together of those two fields, and the habitus is able to incorporate the contradictions of both of those fields. And Ingram and Abrahams note that this really requires a high degree of reflexivity. The other thing that can happen when you try to bring two fields together is destabilization. And this is where it's more of a struggle to incorporate those fields. And it's an ongoing struggle as both the old and the new habitus vie for dominance. And this is really experienced by the individual in terms of conflict and tension, and more in line with Bourdieu's notion of hysteresis. And so I anticipate that these kind of theoretical tools will help us to understand what are going to be quite different responses to systemic change efforts, ranging from those who are on the front line to the public sector managers who are overseeing these changes. So just to wrap up, I just want to say that when we're thinking about children who are homeless without any sense of home or any place to go, I think we can do more than simply reject systemic carelessness. We can actually go about building alternatives. And what I wanted to get across today is that this transformational systemic change is already happening. And it's our job, along with others in partnership, to make sure that these possibilities become enduring systems of care. Okay, I think I'll leave it there for now and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for a very well presented and well-argued paper on homelessness and childhood. We've got I've got many people clapping you. Are there any questions for the moment?
Hi, I might jump in at Sophie. Can you hear me?
Hi, Sophie.
Hi, great talk. It was really interesting. And when you brought the solution-oriented sociology, I was like, oh, I had maybe a practical question. So a lot of your talk was quite theoretical, but your intention is quite practical. In your experience as kind of a researcher straddling this, how do you communicate these deeply theoretical things in the community context, and what's worked for you doing that? Yeah, because I know that can be a challenge in and of itself sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, because that's been quite a journey, I think, for me personally. I think when I leaving academic institutions and moving into this kind of field where you're working much more closely with people delivering services and developing services, I started off, with this sort of mindset that, I've got this theoretical knowledge and it's just about applying it and translating it. But actually in practice, it's having to shift that idea of translation, I think, and instead thinking about how we democratize these ideas and make them accessible. And what I mean by that is just really being aware of how you're positioning yourself as a so-called expert. And so what I've found is that these theories, these concepts are great, but it's in the problem solving that they're really tested, and that you can develop these theories. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but you're only going to find that out if you're working closely and in collaboration with with the people responsible for bringing about some of the systemic change that we're talking about. So I think it really has to be done with partners, and if people aren't getting it or it's not getting across, then it's not working. You know, then the onus is on that kind of interaction, that relationship, to rework the theory or the understanding, so that it does actually make a contribution. Does that kind of help, Sophie? I'm not sure if I answered that.
Totally, no, and I like what you said about if it's not working, then, you know, maybe we don't need to make it work too much. Maybe it's not the right one. Yeah, no, but it's good. Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Thanks, Sienna. Sorry, thanks, Sophie. Now, Sienna has a question. Would you like to state that question, Sienna? Okay. Sienna? No. Sienna asks the question, have you seen these systemic approaches applied to intersections of needs of various communities, for example, migrant and refugee communities?
Yeah, we're starting to do more work in this area where we're probably not in such a comprehensive way. I think probably the lesson out of some of the systemic change literature and also from the capabilities approach is the importance of not coming in with assumptions around need. And you know, the literature on the ethics of care and care relations makes the same point. And I think particularly working with the communities that you mentioned, we're also doing some work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I think that that principle is, you know, obviously becomes really important as well.
Roger, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, Spen. Yeah.
Right, thanks. Joseph, one of the things myself and Joel, who's also on the meeting here, have been doing some thinking around is some of the effects of kind of the marketization of the community services, human services sector, and funding arrangements on practice and responses to some of these. Well, we were particularly looking at case management practice of young people, but I think it applies in the homelessness sector as well.
Yeah,
I was wondering where that that funding sources fits into your model of systemic change, and how maybe Bourdieu's theory of habitus can help us understand some of the effects that marketization has on, like you described, as kind of human services managers, but also case managers and ground level workers as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a really good point, Ben. And as I was putting together this presentation quite late last night, I took out some of that stuff. But yeah, you're spot on. It's really fundamental to a lot of this, because it does drive some of those adverse incentives or those disincentives within these systems. And you know, there is a lot of stuff around neoliberalism and what it means for the kind of services that are provided. But again, I think the challenge is that we're working with an existing system, and often there is a mix. We're dealing with partly marketized systems. And so how we approach that, and it hasn't been as prominent, I think, but I think we'll get there. It hasn't been quite as prominent in this project. It has in other projects. We really hone in on the collaborative commissioning piece. So rather than government going out to tender and you know, trying to get the best bang for their buck, or really trying to identify what's best practice, let's say, whatever that means, there is a much more collaborative foundation for the commissioning of work. And what that means is that you have government, community organizations like ours working very closely in co-designing these kind of models. And so there's often an outline of an idea, there's a set of tools, resources, all of that. But there's also design work that's going on while we're implementing it. And that's done with organizations like ours because we facilitate that collaboration with what's happening on the ground with communities as well. And so I think that's a really critical piece to redesigning these kind of systems.
Awesome, thanks, man.
Thanks, Ben. Any other questions forthcoming?
Hello, I'll ask a question.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Joseph. I loved your talk, of course. I'm a big fan of the capabilities approach, and coming from the health sector, it's not very commonly. People just tend to not even know what it is really among sort of policymakers and the government people that I work with and know about. So I guess that's my question is, how do we, if part of this is to use a capabilities approach, we have some work to do on convincing policymakers and those in government that this is an approach that's valuable. How do we do that, especially in health, I think, where there's such a dominance of problem-focused or deficit-focused approaches? You got anything to say about that?
Yeah, it's
sort of an epistemological task in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's also a political one as well, I think. Yeah, it's really it's pretty challenging, I have to say, but I think it's really trying to find where there is appetite for what is quite a different approach, and I think when you're dealing with some audiences, whether it's people in the public sector, whether it's practitioners, you can locate champions in those spaces. Like these are people who they've seen the same thing being done again and again and again. It's not working. Nothing's really changing. They're going through different program cycles. Things get, it's just iterations of the same thing basically. And so often they're looking for something else. And I think it's tapping into those champions who get that idea. And so when I'm talking about working with government, it's not this like homogenous block of kind of faceless public sector people. There are people in there that are all over the theory. They're well across it and they're pushing it. And it's really connecting in with those and then seeing where the overlap is with some of the more established approaches. And so often we do have to go quite gently with a capabilities approach, particularly in sectors where there's a big emphasis on risk and vulnerability, quite rightly so. And we're often also competing with things like biomedical understandings of young people's brain development, all that kind of stuff, right? And trauma, which definitely has its place. But that's what I mean around, okay, how do we get the capabilities approach to speak to those things and complement those things? And that's kind of some of the political work that I've only, I do, okay at, only because I've worked very closely with service development and I can just see how they do it. And being with them, it's like a masterclass. It's like, oh, okay, that's how you're presenting capabilities approach to someone who may not be into it.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? And perhaps just if anyone is thinking of a question, I might just ask you, Joseph, I know it's Thursday, and so it's day 4 of Homelessness Week, but is there anything little that we could each do that might publicise some of these issues, apart from getting on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is that original, the original goal of Anti-Poverty Week. It's sort of founding basis of trying to orient some of the work that we're all doing, and I'm sure people are already doing this. I mean, I don't. If you're kind of here today, you're already thinking through this stuff. So it partly is preaching to the converted, but I think it is trying to just maintain that focus on how do we go about reimagining existing systems and prosecuting systemic change and putting a lot of these sociological tools to work. Because what I've found is that, okay, you're dealing with different audiences, but if you can do it, people are often receptive because it gives a vision of an alternative that is within reach. So that's what I guess encourage everyone to do is, you've got all the tools there. You've got the theories, you've got the methodologies. It's really about putting them to doing some of that problem-solving work.
Okay, thank you.
Can
Joanne, yes.
Yeah, I'm turning my camera on and off. On that, do you have, I mean, this is part of some work that I'm trying to do in the drug and alcohol field with young people at the moment, is applying this capabilities approach to a field that is highly medicalized. And that's one of the main barriers to, or one of the main things that we even want to do in our research is just simply change the way that service providers in that sector think about young people, think about drug and alcohol use. Yeah. So, I mean, a really practical question, I think, are there examples from other fields that provide some really practical information for policymakers and service providers about the value and the potential of this capabilities approach?
Yeah, so I think in the area of homelessness, there's a fair bit that's starting to come up now. In a kind of a very self-promotional way, I'd say our work on the evaluative work on the Education First Youth foyers shows some of the tangible outcomes of applying a capabilities approach. So, yes, we looked at the implementation of this model, we looked at qualitative data, but we also had what policymakers were looking for around the hard outcomes. And this was based on longitudinal follow-up data, and we were able to look at different periods of time during that model where the capabilities approach was being delivered quite effectively, and other times where it fell off the radar a bit. And we can see some of the differences amongst the young people that went through that model in terms of their outcomes. So there is a direct connection at that level. I think when you're looking at practitioners, those that, in our organization, we also do training around the practical side of that. We refer to it as advantage thinking. So we do training on that. And when practitioners, frontline workers, see the impact that has on, in this case, young people, they just buy in entirely, because it's not just the transformation within or for that young person, it's also for that worker. And I think that's the other really compelling part to that particular approach. It reorients how, for example, youth workers see themselves and how they do something like case management.
Do you know if there's any evidence about the economic and financial impacts of using a capabilities approach? I mean, and I say that because one of the things that I hear from policymakers in the drug and alcohol field is, give us a business case for why a different approach might work. Give us a sort of cost benefit analysis.
Yeah, that's right. And we anticipated that in the FOIA work. And so we commissioned, KPMG to do that for us, cost benefit work. And comparing it to, it's difficult to compare, but as with that whole methodology, there's caveats all around it. However, comparing it to the specialist homelessness service system, while FOIAs were a sort of middle range cost to set up, and in terms of the housing and service delivery, the benefits far outweighed other existing models. So I think it does present quite a compelling case if you can have that as well. But again, it's also it's really pairing that with some of the case studies, the narrative work that also hooks people in. So I think you kind of need both.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. And I think it's probably time that we start to wrap up. So on behalf of TASA, I would like to thank Joseph for his great presentation today and the wonderful questions. And you will be able to review this on Facebook in a couple of days. So thanks very much, and thanks for your participation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Joseph.
Bye.